Hi, hello everyone. My name is Hadil, and today we're going to talk about nodes in Blender. You're going to see nodes in Blender used everywhere you turn, which is one of the ways that you can edit things in Blender, and it's one of my favorite ways actually to edit it because it kind of reminds me of programming, which is something that I've done for the past 10 years. But it's even better because it's kind of like those websites that teaches kids how to code with blocks that you can arrange based on what you need of them. And that's basically what nodes are. And it also gives you a map of what you're trying to create. Now, when it comes to nodes, I've showed you it twice in two different tutorials. We've actually used it in the geometry nodes tutorial, and I've showed it in the lighting tutorials. When it comes to geometry nodes, that's the only way I know of that you can use geometry nodes. I mean, it's called geometry nodes. Nodes is in the name. And so you have to use nodes. If I go to the geometry nodes tab and then I add any object or any mesh, let's add a cube, then you can add a new group and then play around with the nodes, whether you follow a tutorial or just want to see what kind of nodes there are. There's a documentation for all of the nodes and geometry nodes on Blender. It may not explain everything that you need to know about each node, but you'll definitely find a lot of tutorials that will help you with every node on there. Some are self-explanatory, like the math nodes, for instance, and some are kind of a little bit confusing that you'll need a full tutorial to talk about them. And then for lighting, I only use it, like I said in the lighting tutorial, if I'm adding an image to the light. And it only works if you have a plane with an emission or if you have a spotlight. I've tried it other ways and it didn't work, so I think that's the only way you can add an image to your lighting. And if you want to go to the lighting nodes, you can add a light first. Let's add a point light. It's right in the center, so let's move it so we can see it. And then you can go to the object data properties and choose use nodes. I'll go to the layout, add another window, and then change this to the shader editor because the nodes for lighting is basically the same as the materials for other objects. And you'll see that this is a light output and it has an emission. And you can add an image like I showed before to the color of your emission. White is going to show as light and black is going to hide the light. And then another thing I talked about in the lighting as well is the world. And that is also considered a light. I do have by default an image or an HDRI added to my background. And if I go to the render settings and I go to film, by default, I have this as transparent, but if you remove it and go to the render view, you'll actually see the HDRI. And I only use the nodes with that if I want to rotate it. And this is a good point to talk about Node Wrangler or the Node Wrangler add-on, which everybody says it has to be part of Blender by default, but it still is an add-on that you need to add it to Blender. If you go to Edit, Preferences, and then Add-ons, and you write Node Wrangler, and you turn it on, there are a bunch of shortcuts that you can use. I don't use all of them, but you can see the hotkey list if you want, so you can become much faster when using nodes. But I have a few that I use, and I'll show you the one that I use. If you click on an image or any of the other textures like a noise texture or a Voronoi texture, and then you hit Control-T, you get a mapping and a texture node automatically. So it makes things much easier because otherwise you would have had to search for mapping and then add it, and then search for text coordinate and add it. And now I can rotate my lighting setup. Let's find a place where I can see it rotating. And then if I rotate the Z axis, we can actually see the entire HDRI rotating because technically it kind of resembles a sphere from the inside. It's like those 3D cameras, but in 2D form. That way you can change the reflections from your HDRI, and that's the only way I would use nodes in the world setup. And the final two things that I use nodes for are the materials and compositing. Materials is just the exact same as the lighting. Go back to objects, and it depends on what you're clicking. So because we're clicking the light right now, it's showing a light output. If I click on the object and add a new material, it's going to show the material output. And you can use the nodes over here. So if I search for a Voronoi texture, I'm definitely doing a textures and materials tutorial, but that's for a letter T. So for now, we're just going to talk about nodes in general. And if I plug this into the base color, we can actually see it happening. Now, another thing that I use Node Wrangler with a lot is to view the materials. So if I click Control, Shift, and click on this, it's going to show me that as the final output. It used to show a viewer nodes over here, like the geometry nodes showing right now if you do this. But at the moment, in the newer versions of Blender, it's just plugging it to the surface and it's showing you what is happening directly. But if I click again, Control Shift to the principal BSDF, then it's showing me the material after this is plugged into the base color. It is a little bit different because this is just black and white without any roughness or specular or transmission if I wanted to make this glass. So if I wanted to, let's say, add the transmission, change the color by adding a color ramp. So if I wanted to change the whites to blue and then this to white, we can actually see what is being applied from the principal BSDF. If I want to view what this is doing, then I just hit Control Shift, and this is what Node Wrangler is doing. It's allowing me to have shortcuts to view all of these things with a click of a button rather than pulling this to the surface in order to see it or pulling this to the surface in order to see it. I can just hit the two keys and click, and I can change the view. So that's Node Wrangler for you. And that's how you use nodes in materials. You can definitely go to the material tab and change things over here. If I go over here and search for color ramp, I can definitely add that from here and then change things in the settings here. But I don't like using it with materials. It's just easier to see the entire map over here rather than having toggles all over. So yeah, I prefer it this way. And that's what I use nodes with the most. The other place I use nodes for in every project, even though I don't really touch it in every project, is the compositing tab or the compositing node tree. Because I already have a setup that I like that works with the majority of my projects, and I change it rarely. And this is where I talked about when it comes to viewer nodes. So if I wanted to view this part alone, is going to connect it to the viewer node rather than the composite. So whatever is being exported in the end is going to be this. This is just to view whatever you see over here. I don't have anything right now because I haven't rendered it. So let's just render the image. I don't know how it's going to look. Let's actually check it first. Okay, let's render this image. Now that I have this rendered, I can go to the compositing tool, and now I can actually view my render. And this is where you start compositing. It's kind of like Photoshop. You have an image that is already exported, and then you add it to Photoshop. You start compositing and editing it. This is what you do over here. Now, what I like to do is use lens distortion and adding glare. And I took this from this tutorial and I loved it, but I don't do it as extreme as the person in the tutorial does it. But what this does is if I have something that reflects light, then the glare will add a little bit of realism to it. Because if you get a material that reflects a light into the sun and see how that will create a little bit of sparkles and glow, that's what this is doing. I like fog glow, but sometimes I do use streaks. Right now I don't have anything that is reflecting lights. I don't have any metallic materials. Let's try maybe make this metallic so it reflects light. Let's rotate it, remove transmission, and decrease the roughness. Now we have a bit of a strong reflection over here. I'll render it again. Now this is showing the composited image. If I wanted to change it to the view layer, it's going to show the difference. See how that glow is affecting this area if I choose composite. Now if I close this, go to composite, the viewer is what's showing right now. It's showing only the image. If I go back to the lens distortion, then we actually see the glow happening. Right now it's doing streaks. If I do fog glow, it's going to be slightly different. So it depends on my project. If I want it to have those streak looking stars, you can also do simple star. But because it's really dense, it's not showing the stars. But if I have a small reflection over here, it's going to show the star clearly. I like streaks or fog glow most. Right now, I think streaks looks really nice. And then that's the only thing I would change if I wanted to change this in any of the projects, unless I want something a little bit more drastic, depending on the project, because the majority of my projects will work with this setup. I don't really have to change it, but sometimes I do have to change the distortion or the dispersion. So if I go to 0.05, you'll see the difference, especially in the corners or on the edges. And then if I wanted to distort this, if I remove the fit, you'll actually see the distortion happening, but I like to fit it. Now, if I make this 0, you actually see black edges over here because it's distorting the image. If I make it higher, you'll see the distortion. And then for this, if I do 0.05, you can actually see the 3D lighting effect. And then what I do is fit it. So now it's fitting my screen. So the distortion and the dispersion is not really changing my screen boundaries. But I like it at 0.01. It's just very subtle, and you can see it if I remove it from here. And then what I do with glare, per that tutorial that I talked about, is add it on top of the image. If I view the glare alone, you will see that it looks like this. So it's showing that there is a glare over here, and then there's another one over here. And you can actually see the streaks a little bit if you look closely. And if I change it to fog glow, you'll see that it's just a noise. It's kind of like noise particles or a glow around the light rather than a bunch of streaks or stars. And I also touched this if I wanted to export masks. If I go to the view layer settings, then I can export passes. And what passes does is create a kind of mask that you can add to your project. You can export it so you can edit in Photoshop and After Effects, which is what I do if I needed to add masks. Sometimes there are things that are extremely glowy that I don't need to add extra glare to them. And so I would remove them using crypto mats right here. I will render them with the object and the material. Right now, you're going to see that they're black if I view them over here, or they don't really have any information because you have to select the things that you want to render before you render your images. I've made a mistake, or it wasn't a mistake rather than a lack of information. And I thought I could render all of the crypto mats and any of the masks alone without needing to render the entire project. But it turns out that you only get information if you render it, the image itself. Yeah, if you want a tutorial on compositing, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of tutorials out there. I'm just showing you where you could use nodes because that's what this tutorial is about. So yeah, to reiterate, I use nodes mostly with materials and compositing. And if you want to use geometry nodes, nodes is the only way to go. And then I do use it with lighting and world for specific reasons. Light if I wanted to add an image to a spotlight or a plane, and with world if I wanted to rotate an HDRI. Yeah, it's a short tutorial today, but I hope it was helpful and at least help you in finding tutorials for Blender that deals with all of this stuff. I'm definitely going to talk more about nodes in materials because I will start making tutorials after I'm done with the A to Z tutorials that are specific to materials and some of the projects that I create. Okay, that's all for this week. See you next week. Bye.